and good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I'm Alan Leshner, and I'm what's known as the once and current CEO of AAAS. I was the CEO from 2001 to 2015, and then I happily retired, enjoying unemployment. And then they asked me to come back and fill in during a hiatus until a permanent CEO has been hired. So I'm technically the interim CEO, but I have no idea who I actually am in the organization. And I get the great pleasure to actually, for me, once again, introduce the Riley Lecture, and in this case, the 2019 Charles Valentine Riley Lecture. Now, this is a particularly good and particularly important year since it's the 10th anniversary of this lecture. We're putting great pressure on Dr. Zeigler by that. And it commemorates the legacy of Charles Valentine Riley, who was in fact a major 19th century figure who had a vision that hopefully will only increasingly play out over time of using modern science to in fact advance agriculture and the provision of food for people. The generation of scientific knowledge is critical to every aspect of agriculture. You all know that as well or better than I. And supporting a vibrant agriculture research enterprise is fully critical to every aspect of modern life. In Dr. Riley's case, among his many accomplishments, he was the state of Missouri's first state entomologist, the chief of the U.S. Entomological Commission, and finally the chief entomologist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And of course, he had a connection to AAAS. He was, in fact, the vice president for our biology section in 1888. By the way, there's an interesting sort of history exhibit outside that the National Library of Medicine provided, and I recommend it to all of you. With his vision in mind, this lecture is an important opportunity to examine the critical role that science plays in advancing agriculture, conserving natural resources, and ensuring food security. Many of us think that whenever there's an anniversary, it's a good time to also be thinking about where we're going in the future, and I hope during the questioning period this afternoon we'll press on that issue. That is, where is the science of agriculture, and where is it going to go, and where will we as a country find the ways in which to take maximal use of the knowledge that it provides. We have a full program, and I won't talk too much longer. I do want to thank the sponsors. The key partner is, of course, the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and many of its units are participating and supporting this. The Agricultural Research Service, Economic Research Service, the Forest Service, and NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And of course, Mars Incorporated has been a sponsor of this for a long time, and we're very grateful for that. So thank everybody for that. And I get the pleasure of introducing this year's Riley Lecture, the 10th anniversary Riley Lecture, who's Dr. Robert Zeigler. His full bio is in the program, and I won't take the time to go through it. But let me mention that he's Director General Emeritus of the International Rice Research Institute. He's spent a lifetime working to sustainably improve cereal production, particularly rice, and with great pleasure, I give you the 10th annual Charles Riley Lecture.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Leshner. Not like there's any pressure that it's the 10th lecture that will be expected to exceed all expectations, I'm sure. It really is very much an honor to be invited to present to this lecture. I wasn't fully aware of what an honor it was until word was out and I started getting all sorts of messages in my inbox from entomologists telling me how I better do Dr. Riley right. So it is quite the pleasure and the honor to be here. And it's an honor it's a pleasure to be able to talk about something that really has been, I've been thinking about during most of my professional career, and that is kind of the interplay between policy and science and technology, and they're dynamic, they're, like to think of it, a yin and yang kind of relationship. And I want to just let you know what I'm thinking about when I say policy and food security, et cetera. And when I think about policies, I think about that they're really a codification of our societal norms and values. And as our values change, our ways of looking at the world and how we incorporate them into policies changes. And in a representative democracy, it can be a pretty messy and slow process. And that, as I mentioned, the science and the technologies can be mutually enforcing or not, as we'll see. And there are always unintended consequences. And I don't want to imply that public policies around food security are something new. If we look back at ancient civilizations, our massive investments in infrastructure, irrigation, transportations were tremendous public policy decisions. And Kublai Khan, back in 1261, actually created an office for the stimulation of agriculture. That was about 600 years before Abraham Lincoln created the United States Department of Agriculture. So public policies and technology and food security have been intertwined ever since the creation of agriculture for all practical purposes. And food security, I think that it blithely rolls off our tongue, but it really is a complex issue of adequate, affordable, available, safe food for all members of society so that we can lead decent lives. But up until and through the industrial revolutions, famines were an accepted, well, I don't know accepted, but were a part of regular life. Natural calamities, poorly thought out public policy, as it were, led up to famines repeatedly throughout human history, and it was something that people just accepted and lived with. And in fact, it was considered to be one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, like war, disease, and probably talk radio. And as we look today, food security still remains a problem, and we're seeing an increase in the number of hungry people. And the IPCC is predicting that we will face, as a result of climate change, rising food prices in the coming decades. And this is something, the question of food security and human welfare was wrapped up really in the origins of the science of economics. And Thomas Malthus presented his essay in 1798 on the principle of population and its impact on human society. And he basically had the insight that food supply or technology increases or grows at an arithmetic pace, while population growth proceeds at an exponential rate. And as population exceeds the ability of technology or the food supply to be fed, we have famines that break out, and that was considered to be the Malthusian trap. And that beautiful view of human fate, that as we continued to grow as people, we would eventually outstrip our resources and starve to death, helped lead to the description of economics as the dismal science. I would never say that to my economist friends, of course. But that was the prevailing view through the through the 18th century, and 19th and into the 20th century. But as we look into our own lifespans, what is the worldview related to population growth and food security? Well, when I was coming up in undergraduate school at Illinois, I was reading these books. The Famine 1975, America's Decision, Who Will Survive, was written by a couple of plant pathologists. And as a plant pathologist, I take some umbrage at that. But basically, the premise was, particularly Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, was that human populations would essentially exceed the carrying capacity of the Earth, applying an ecological principles to our human situation on Earth. And the prediction was that in the 1970s and 1980s, Asian countries would be basket cases, and they should be abandoned. And that was a prevailing driver of thinking for many people, but others had different perspectives, of course. And the perspectives on famine, et cetera, were rooted in, I believe, in an understanding that policies actually had exacerbated famine and food security over the centuries. We have examples of the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, the Bengal famine in 1943, and of course the terrible catastrophes in Russia and China in the mid-century. But policies have actually prevented other famines, and certainly one that comes to my mind when I was in the Peace Corps in Africa in the 70s, there was tremendous concern over starvation in the Sahel because of a massive drought. And I think it's pretty clear that our political or policy interventions prevented those famines. But I think the question remains in my mind is, are modern famines the result of failed policy? And I can just go ahead and answer that, but I think the answer is yes. But I do think we need to explore it a little bit more. And as a plant pathologist, I have to go back to the Irish potato famine to look at the relationship between policies and famine. Back in the 1840s, potatoes were the mainstay of food in Europe, and particularly in Ireland. But there was an introduction of a disease from Latin America, late blight caused by the fungus-like organism Phytophthora infestans, that absolutely wiped out the potato crop across Europe, not just in Ireland, but across all of Europe. And if you take a look at, if you can imagine, if you're depending on potatoes for your main food, and you look at your potato fields and they look like that, you're in serious problems. And what happened was that by 1852, over 1 million Irish had died of starvation, and another 1 million had emigrated to the United States. But the question is, there wasn't that level of starvation. Why was there not that level of starvation in England and in the rest of Europe? And the fact is that it was English policies, their corn laws, their protectionist tariffs that kept the price of food artificially high in England. So millions of Irish, or the 1 million Irish, starved in the presence of relative abundant food. So that to me really, and I read that as a graduate student at Cornell when I was starting my PhD, and that really seared into my mind that it was not just the disease or the crop loss that caused the famine, it was the way our policymakers, or their policymakers, addressed it. And it is striking when we think about policymakers addressing the potential of food security, potential of famine and food security. Look at the post-World War II community, coming out of a horrible series of wars, First and Second World Wars, basically making a decision that we should invest in means so that at least we can remove one of the causes of war, which was hunger and lack of food, and created a whole set of international organizations that would address these problems, the United Nations FAO, World Food Program, etc. Likewise, invested in development banks that would create the infrastructure, social and physical, that would allow us to create systems where food security would no longer be an issue, and major philanthropic investments, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, et cetera. But of course, policies by themselves cannot eliminate hunger and famine. You just don't create a bureaucracy. You actually have to create something material. And one of the institutional networks that was created to help address the issue of food security was the International Agricultural Research Institutes, and I was fortunate enough to serve with the International Rice Research Institute. And that set of organizations was created explicitly to set forth technologies, or to create technologies that would enable a food secure world. And I would like to talk a little bit about some of the science and the technology that have contributed to our global food security. And I'll give some examples from rice. And I was particularly gratified to see on the cover of the program that outstanding illustration of yin and yang using polished rice and black rice. And why do I want to talk about rice other than it's my personal passion? It's perhaps the oldest domesticated crop in the world, has an extraordinary genetic diversity. It's also the world's most important food staple. Half the world's population, human population, depends on rice, and over 75% of the world's poor depend upon rice as their main source. And it's the sort of the poster child of the Green Revolution in Asia. And it is an example of how technology and policy work together to really transform our vision of what the world might look like. Back in the 1960s, rice yields in the world were very low, about 1.5 tons per hectare. If you added fertilizers, the plant just grew tall, added a few leaves, and fell over, and actually had a lower yield. And widespread famines were predicted, as I mentioned earlier. By the 1970s, however, the rice breeders had created modern, semi-dwarf varieties that had very high yield, responded to fertilizer, by basically changing the plant architecture. And if you look at that slide there, the tall plant in the middle is what a traditional rice looked like. It yielded very low, had a lot of leaves and stems, but heaven forbid there should be a typhoon or any strong winds, et cetera, and forget about adding fertilizer. And so our changing of the plant architecture through plant breeding enabled these plants to yield much higher grain. And today our yields, average global yields, are over 4 tons per hectare. And I think there is general agreement among the economists of the world that the Asian economic miracle was built on a foundation of abundant and affordable rice supplies. And there's no doubt that the creation of these rice varieties and their widespread adoption and production basically saved millions and millions of people from starvation. And if you look at the data from Southeast Asia, you can see the red line is the growth in harvested area from 1960 to 2013. Green is the production, and it's pretty stunning that the rice areas less than doubled over that 50 or 60-year time period, and production increased fourfold. And the New York Times states very clearly that the Green Revolution is generally believed to have saved over 1 billion lives, making it arguably one of the greatest investments, philanthropic investments in human history. But it wasn't just the science of the changing of the plant architecture and its ability to yield that made the difference. It was, in fact, dependent on a coordinated set of policies that were put in place. And there was, as I mentioned, there was investments by countries in creating the centers that would develop the new technologies. But more importantly, there was simultaneous investments in irrigation, infrastructure, in roads, in education, and in fertilizer subsidies. Understanding that without the enabling political framework, the technology of the new varieties simply couldn't realize their potential. And I want to just say a word about nitrogen, because I think it's kind of an interesting It's an interesting topic. My wife rolls her eyes when I say that, but I think right, the whole story around nitrogen is kind of neat. And nitrogen, it makes up 78% of our atmosphere. It's a major component of all living things. And plants get their nitrogen from soil. And by and large, soil nitrogen's kind of hard to come by. That's one of the main limiting factors of plant growth. And until the 19th century, nitrogen came basically from animal manure or guano, or to some extent crop residues. And there were massive projections of massive fertilizer shortages in the 18th and 19th centuries. And in fact, that was one of the processes behind Malthus's predictions that we would outstrip our ability to produce foods. And also, by the way, nitrogen is a key component of explosives. So control and the source of nitrogen was primarily guano deposits and mineral deposits in South America and to some extent North Africa. And control of the sea lanes that Britain controlled was problematic for some countries, particularly Germany. So in the early 1900s, Haber and Bosch developed the process for converting atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, which could then be converted into explosives and fertilizers. And basically today, the modern agriculture depends in one way or another on the Haber-Bosch process of nitrogen production. And that leads me to an observation that I'd like to kind of share with you throughout the remainder of my talk, and that is the unintended consequences and how they repeatedly come to the surface. And the German government was interested in funding work on developing alternative sources of ammonia for explosives, as war was a constant in 19th century Europe. And fertilizer, in some ways, can be considered a side effect or an unintended consequence of the process. And that the irony that billions of people today are fed through a process that was originally intended to create explosives that would kill thousands or millions is quite intriguing to me. But back to Thomas Malthus and the Green Revolution. Clearly, his prediction didn't come to pass. Population growth did not outstrip our technological ability to produce our food. And in some ways, if you think about it, the way innovation feeds upon itself, the child of innovation creates more children of innovation, much the way parents produce more children and their children produce children. So it's in some ways, in hindsight, it's not terribly surprising that our technology has largely been able to keep up with our demand for food. And again, if we look at our policies related to food security, after the Green Revolution, the tremendous growth in food production in developing countries was enabled by the policy framework. But as our food supplies became more abundant, we began to become complacent. And late in the 1980s into the 1990s, the concerns about our environment began to replace our concerns about food security. Rightfully so, and concerns about climate change, biodiversity, desertification, etc., characterized the Rio Summit, 1992, from which the Convention on Biological Diversity developed, where biodiversity began to be seen as a sovereign resource rather than a jointly held human resource. And Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, basically said that those who profited from biological diversity, genetic diversity, would have to share that with countries where that biological diversity was discovered. So there was a lot of concern about how we would use our global resources. And the intention was to protect them and to make sure that the people who created those biological resources, traditional farmers, for example, would share in the benefits of those who extracted wealth from them. And then there was the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, which put severe restrictions on genetically modified organisms. And we can't overstate the importance of genetic resources and the biodiversity. Basically, when we look at our future of food production in this world, it will continue to depend upon the creation of newer and better crop cultivars through breeding programs, and that will be drawn from the existing genetic diversity of our crops and their wild relatives. And we have a global system of gene banks, and these gene banks were in charge of maintaining and distributing genetic diversity around the world, and they were freely exchanging materials before the Convention on Biological Diversity. But today, the conventions and protocols around it, the transformation of genetic resources from a global property to a sovereign resource has really seized up the exchange of genetic resources. And the question is that as we are just beginning to be able to use these genetic resources, how will they be made available? And that's something I think we need to discuss. I'll talk a little bit about it here in the future. So will these genetic resources, will they be freely available, or will they be available at all? And so, again, an unintended consequence of our policies is that the Convention on Biological Diversity, which had the world's best intentions, has actually resulted in the constraint of exchange of genetic resources around the world, and that we are looking at a situation where the opportunity to tap into to genetic resources is being constrained, and as they're being treated as sovereign resources. And I think what we're seeing today is that we have the exchange of genetic resources really being grinding to a near halt. And that's particularly concerning because we have a situation where, with the changing climate, our crops really are going to have to be bred to deal with pretty severe changes in conditions. We know that we have changes in temperature, rainfall, sea level, water, and severe weather coming, and they're hitting us now. And the question is, how will we take today's varieties that really can't cope, and how can we transform them? How can we use our genetic resources to get them into a situation where we can deal with these challenges? And making crops climate ready is, I think, one of the great challenges of plant sciences facing us in the coming decades. Drought tolerance, salt tolerance, flooding, heat, all of these are going to be problems across very large areas of our agricultural landscape. And we know that there are solutions to these challenges. They are in our gene banks, they're in our collections of genetic resources, they're in wild relatives, they're in traditional varieties, and this is just a slide of wild relatives of rice, all of which carry very, very interesting traits, but it's extraordinarily difficult, or has been extraordinarily difficult, to get into useful rice varieties. And it basically, a plant breeder who has a beautiful variety that's lacking one or two traits is loath to make a cross with one of those plants and try to get something useful out of it. I like to think of it, it's like if you're dealt an inside straight and your only opportunity to fill that inside straight is to take all the cards, reshuffle them, and hope you can draw out an inside, your perfect straight again. Basically, it's extraordinarily unlikely, and that is the challenge that has faced plant breeders up until now. But as we look at what's happening in our scientific environment, there's a tremendous revolution that's underway. And there are parallel revolutions in biology, in communications, and in computational power. We have the revolution in our understanding of biological and biology and genetics and physiology of our plants. This generates an enormous amount of data which we can now store and process. We can access it remotely. We have teams that can work together real time around the world. So we're in a situation where, as our capacity and our understanding grows, that we are in a position where we can begin to manipulate our plants in a way that we can meet the challenges presented by climate change. And in rice, you know, it's a great example because in order to take advantage of these advances, we need to be able to access the full DNA sequence. And shortly before I joined the International Rice Research Institute as its director, the first DNA sequence was published, made the cover of Science magazine, and it was a manifestation of the intersection of public policy and science. There were policy decisions in a number of different countries to invest in the sequencing of the rice genome. And there was equally a decision to invest in publicly available genetic sequence. In 2014, IRRI collaborated with the government of China, or Chinese institutes, and with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and sequenced 3,000 rice genomes. And I don't think it even made like the third page of a footnote somewhere. But just the acceleration of our technologies and the commitment of scientists and governments is pretty impressive. And if we look at where we are going with the DNA sequencing and the rate of our growth in knowledge, it's pretty impressive. For quite a while, for about 15 years, the cost of sequencing a genome followed Moore's law, where about every 18 months the cost was cut in half. And then the bottom fell out. And basically, as we all know, generating DNA sequences is fairly trivial now, and even whole organism sequences are fairly straightforward. But it's important that we understand that the ability to inexpensively sequence all these genomes is a result of massive public investment. Political decisions, policy decisions that it was in the interest of society to put the money into sequencing. Now, okay, most of that investment was going toward medical applications, and as plant and agricultural sciences are their poor cousins, we sort of got the crumbs off the tables, but they were very good crumbs, that's for sure. And that has set up the genetic revolution in plant sciences and crop breeding. And we're looking at whole new ways to approach engineering crops. CRISPR is the one that's in you open up any issue of Science and you'll see multiple articles on the CRISPR technology. Basically, it's a very straightforward way to very precisely edit the genome. And to go back to the inside straight analogy, instead of having to reshuffle the deck, you can basically take a card and put it in where it needs to go, or just print a brand new card and do it yourself. And again on the mention of unintended consequences, CRISPR is a bacterial immune system effectively to protect it against viruses, and the idea of using it as a gene editing technique is kind of a nice twist. Now, we have, as a result of these technologies, we have quite, waiting in the wings, as it were, our ability to make some major engineering and differences in our crop plants. We can design for higher yields, less water, nitrogen use, design foods, much better foods for our modern diets. If we look at starch composition, fiber composition, nutrient content, etc., these are all at the point where we will be able to re-engineer our crop plants quite effectively, and at the same time pay attention to our environment. These will be genetically modified crops. Now the question is, what will be the fate of these genetically modified crops? And just as I was thinking about this, I was reminded that Steve Long, I think, presented the lecture a number of years ago, and I've been worked with his group on manipulating plant photosynthesis. And I think that, you know, not only can we sort of change our nutrient content of crops, et cetera, but we're in a position where we can fundamentally modify the very makeup of some of the fundamental processes of our crop plants, like photosynthesis, and sort of reverse some of the trade-offs that have been made in evolution so that we can perfect our crops better for agriculture. Now, the techniques that we are using, CRISPR, I think, is just a great example, I think reveal how the problem we have with our policies that enable our science. And that is that, as I mentioned in my first or second slide, the developing policies particularly in representative democracies, is a pretty messy undertaking and takes time. And as our technologies begin to move more quickly, the impact of this time it takes to develop a policy to respond to new technologies can start to cause some problems. Now, CRISPR is a great tool. There's no transfer of any foreign DNA or synthetic DNA in the final product. It's highly specific target. It's indistinguishable from natural mutations. And it's indistinguishable from unnatural mutations that are caused by radiation or chemical. But the European Court of Justice, their Supreme Court, ruled in July of 2018 that the CRISPR technology would fall exactly under the same regulations as genetically modified crops. And as you know, the European regulatory system is such that it is extraordinarily difficult to get a genetically modified crop approved. Now, the policy that was written in Europe in the 1990s, I suppose, is being applied to technology developed just a few years ago. And we're in a situation where products and plants that are clearly not carrying any genetic novel or foreign DNA are being treated as if they had. So I think we're seeing a situation where the change in policy to allow and to respond to new technologies is something that's starting to hang us up. And we have to be concerned about that because we have major changes in what we are asking of our food supply. When we were looking at the challenges of the 1950s and the 1960s, we were looking at a world that was short of calories. If we didn't have enough calories, you'd die, and it didn't matter if you had protein or vitamins or what have you. You just died of lack of calories. But that is no longer a problem. We're looking now at a whole series of other kinds of problems before us. We have undernutrition, where we're having vitamin and mineral deficiencies, iron and zinc, for example. Overnutrition and obesity is a greater problem that's resulting in cardiovascular disease, colorectal health, and a realization that our gut microbiome and a healthy metabolism depend on what kind of foods we're eating and their composition, and of course diabetes. Micronutrient deficiencies are a very, very serious constraint across the world. Zinc, iron, vitamin A, causing very serious problems. And vitamin A is something that's particularly interesting to me. It's a vitamin A deficiency in rice-growing countries is extremely severe, has very, very serious impact of child mortality, measles susceptibility, night blindness, and of course, death. And hundreds of millions of children face a seriously impacted health because of vitamin A deficiency. And there has been a novel rice strain, I suppose you could say, developed that actually carries beta-carotene, which is converted by humans into vitamin A. A golden rice, a genetically modified rice that produces dietarily significant levels of vitamin A for humans. And it was created in the late 1990s. And we have been working, and that's something that my institute was working on very hard over my entire tenure there of over a decade, to try to convert that prototype vitamin A or beta-carotene rich rice into a product that farmers could grow and poor consumers could meet. And for the record, it's still not out yet. And that, I think, is a really interesting story. And it's a political story, and it's a long story, and I won't go into it in any detail, but I just want to highlight that, it was quite an education to look at a technology that was viewed so differently from different sides. Those of us who worked on developing golden rice saw it as a tremendous breakthrough that could be a great benefit to the poor and the hungry. Those who objected to genetically modified crops saw it as a Trojan horse for evil multinationals. And as an institution, as a public institution, depending on public funds to develop this, we were at quite a challenge, because half of our donors didn't want us to do any work on genetically modified crops, and the other half did. So it was always quite a balancing act, I can tell you. But what was really revealing to me was that the golden rice was completely uninteresting to the private sector. The market is very poor people who don't have any money, and all they could see was downside risk. So this was a situation where the private sector was uninterested. In fact, they ran the other way in developing this technology, and the public institutions were left with the challenge of developing it. And that was quite an education for me, because the resources required to develop a GMO crop, if I would, are not technical resources. They are essentially political resources. It's a question of communication to the public, communication to donors that it's worthwhile to support the work that's required to register a product in a country. Not a technical issue, it's a regulatory issue, something that the public sector is not particularly adept at, I hate to say. Having said that, the program moves forward and has reached levels of approval. So frankly, I would be surprised if before 2025 we have golden rice in farmers' fields, which is essentially over 25 years after the technology was developed. And I think we need to think hard about where we are in our societies and our policies and our politics as to how something like that occurs. And that is another set of unintended consequences, where biosafety concerns were originally justified to have tight GMO regulation, and that has resulted in raising the costs of taking a genetically engineered crop to market to astronomical levels, and something that the public sector is really incapable of dealing with. And we look at some of the risks around taking genetically engineered crops to market. Bayer Corporation settled a $750 million lawsuit because they had a tiny admixture of genetically engineered rice in some of their crops that kept all of the U.S. rice crop out of Europe. And that fear of liability was a large part of stymieing the development of golden rice. And I think what's really fascinating is that if you listen to critics of genetically engineered crops, and they tell you that it's just the multinationals who are interested in genetically engineered crops. Well, one of the reasons for that is that the only ones who can afford the liability and take the risks are multinational organizations or multinational companies. So it's like it has created its own worst nightmare in going against GMOs. Another interesting example of the unintended consequences of well-intended policies is the question of BT corn. Now, the BT corn is protected against attacks by an earworm. Critics say there's a fear of unknown performance, and that therefore that's bad. We can't have anything happening we don't know about. But the BT also protects the corn against ear rot fungi. And these ear rot fungi produce very serious toxins that are highly toxic to vertebrates, mammals in particular, like us, carcinogens. GMO corn is toxin-free. So the unintended consequence for a earworm-resistant genetically engineered crop is freedom from mycotoxins in our corn supply. And we don't hear anything about that unintended consequence. Now, just to wrap things up, I just want to say a word on big data. One of the great opportunities I had at Erie was to observe some of the technology being applied to challenges in developing countries. And the launching of European, US satellites and having the data collected from those satellites being made publicly available was really, really, really exciting. And it enabled our crop modelers, geographers, agronomists, et cetera, to come together and basically develop pictures of real-time predictions of rice production across Southeast Asia, and then eventually South Asia. And that enabled us to have a view into the future of what our food availability would be around the time of harvest. And that was a massive amount of data and was extremely valuable for traders, for government policymakers, those involved in dealing with natural calamities, et cetera. We could track the impact of a typhoon in real time. We were able to tell the Philippine government within 2 days what the loss of their rice crop was when a major typhoon went through. And that was all a great, great opportunity and exciting for our scientists. But the question very quickly became, well, who owns that data? And who owns the systems that allow us to predict? And we were repeatedly approached by large international traders to buy the technology so that they would then have the competitive edge. And so the question then started to come out is, well, where do publicly created data sets sit? And where does private ownership begin? And it really is something that to me is kind of a conundrum. And if we look at the public sector, and most of us in this room are public sector, that the public sector really is where the investments are made in the highest risk areas. the knowledge, moving the frontiers of knowledge forward. And it's very high-risk work. And what's the gain? And where's the commercial gain? That's questionable. And the public investment does feed that pipeline of innovation, as we saw in the DNA sequencing. And those gains will translate into societal gains, and the private sector plays that great role of going the last mile and taking that innovation that largely came out of the public sector and translating that into practical applications. And they have relatively low risk and very, very, very high gains. And so the question then that I ask myself is, we're in a situation where we've socialized the risk and we privatize the gain. And is that a sustainable model? And if we look at our public institutions that are increasingly starved of resources, I think we need to ask ourselves, back to our policymakers, where is the proper balance? And of course, I ask myself, is eliminating public investments an even worse idea? And we've got the big policy challenges that are facing us. And I touched on genetic resources. How do we manage our genetic resources? How do we manage our genetic engineering of our crops and our regulations in the public sector? Many of the constraints on genetically engineered crops were founded in well-intentioned instruments. I think that they have gone off the rails a bit. How do we get back to where we can have a reasonable balance between regulation and freedom to operate? The question of who pays and who profits. Again, the public and private sector, what do we do about our big data, intellectual property and open access that I read about almost weekly in Science, and of course issues around greenhouse gas emissions. And now the lessons that I would like to at least leave you with is that it should be pretty clear that policies and technologies can be mutually reinforcing or not when they get out of sync. Unintended consequences are actually a feature. They're not a bug of innovation, and they're certainly not always bad. And what is bad depends on where you sit. Just think of somebody hailing an Uber or somebody who has a career as a taxi driver. And coming back to our Malthusian trap, we have a situation where our predictions of Thomas Malthus did not come to pass. But I wonder if we should look at that Malthusian model from a different perspective and look at technological innovation and policy development. And if we consider the way our policies are developed in a linear process, technological innovation exponential, are we going to end up in a political trap as opposed to a Malthusian trap? And will we end up with a major overrun of ourselves? And those of you who are Harari readers, fans of some of his books, he tends to think that artificial intelligence will take us to a new level and we'll all be irrelevant anyway. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much.
That was great. You did the 10th anniversary proud. Terrific job. And now to kick off the discussion, we're very fortunate to have a panel that will in fact respond to Dr. Zeigler's talk and him.
Do I stay up here or go down?
Stay.
Okay.
Stay. Pick a chair.
Okay, thank you.
You could have the second chair. We'll put Kathy there. And fortunately, Catherine Woteki has agreed to be the moderator of the discussion and the panel. On the panel will be Ann Bartuska, Joe Glauber, Andrew LaVigne, and Kathy will introduce them. I can't imagine Kathy really needs an introduction to this crowd. She's a former Undersecretary of Agriculture, Chief Scientist, but she's had like 30 other prominent positions in the scientific and agriculture communities. So please.
Thank you, Alan. And let me ask the three panelists to join us on the stage. And while they're coming up, Dr. Zeigler sure has given us a lot to think about and also a lot to talk about. And while the panelists are getting seated, I'd like to plant a thought in your minds, or actually two thoughts. One is, we're going to have an initial round of questions and discussion with the panel, but then we're going to open it up for everybody to ask questions. So please start thinking about what your questions might be. And the second thought is that there are flyers out in the lobby for two really interesting books. One of them is one that Dr. Zeigler has edited and that will be coming out very soon, entitled Sustaining Global Food Security. And these ideas that he's explored with us this afternoon in what was really a super lecture are explored in more depth in the book. So there's a flyer for that.
You push the space bar on the yeah.
There you go. And there's a picture of it. And then this is the 10th anniversary of the Charles Valentine Lecture here at AAAS. And it is also the year that a biography of Charles Valentine Riley was published earlier this summer. And one of the co-authors of that biography is in the audience, Dr. Donald Weber, ARS entomologist, research entomologist. And the publisher is offering copies of the book at a reduced price if you order through this flyer. So the book is also a great read about a self-taught biologist who was incredibly well-networked in the scientific community of the 1800s and played a very prominent role in establishing the research trajectories for the Department of Agriculture and also the Smithsonian Institution. So interesting read for those of you who are interested in science policy. So our set of panel discussants this afternoon consist of Dr. Ann Bartuska, who is leading the programs on land, water, and natural resources for the future. Dr. Joe Glauber, Senior Research Fellow at IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and Mr. Andy LaVigne, President and CEO of the American Seed Trade Association. So welcome to all of you. And what I'd like to do is to kick off our discussion this afternoon with a question to each of you. And I thought I had them pulled up here on my iPad, and it's loading. So let me kick off, Andy, by posing the first question to you while this is continuing to load. And that is that Dr. Zeigler has raised some interesting problems associated with the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the lag in regulation and policy as it relates to new genetic technologies that are quite different and distinct from the older ones that informed those policies. So from your perspective, from an organization whose members are very much interested in these policy questions, what do you think we can do about some of these dilemmas that he's posed?
Well, Kathy, thanks for getting on me first. Dr. Zeigler hit on a number of issues that are facing, I think, public and private, from our perspective, plant breeding community throughout the world right now, and will continue to, because of one of the policy side when we deal with CBD and the other global policies that oversee or regulate the use of germplasm on a global basis are not well agreed upon. Should this speak loud?
No, it should be.
Okay. Has everybody hear me all right? Okay. Are not well agreed upon globally. We have, we work very closely with our U.S. government and our trading partners around the world, as well as other trade associations that work with the seed companies globally, and trying to develop policies that respect the country's own germplasm that are native to their origins, and as well as enable the ability of movement of germplasm to be bred and tested throughout the world really has ground to a halt because of various views around those policies. And a lot of countries have signed on to the CBD, but are far from being in compliance to it. And so there are a lot of factors that come into play there that I could take the rest of the afternoon on it. But Kathy, I think what you hit on that is most interesting to us at ASTA, and I think to the research plant breeding biology community, is just that rapid evolution. And Dr. Zeigler, you hit it on the head. I often use Moore's law as an example of what's happening in plant biology today, in genetics, and how rapidly it's changing. And there's just the discovery that we have that's going on every day, that it's not just plant breeding methods, it's understanding science. Part of my background is coming from Florida and working with the citrus growers, and that we're all well aware of what citrus greening is doing to the citrus industry. I just read today that they have finally cultured the bacteria that causes citrus greening. And it's a joint project between Washington State and University of Florida, and I think Davis. And that now enables them to more accurately target resistance within citrus families. And that discovery is happening every day in every crop around the world. And all you have to do is read any journal. How do you take advantage of that public and private interaction that's going on there today? I think that's where I'm really concerned of, I'm going to make a blanket statement, but policy will never keep up with the rapid evolution of innovation and discovery. So how do we develop policy that allows, that adapts with that rapidly changing innovation? That's what we're trying to encourage as we look at gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9, and what will be next. Because whatever, if we think in that GMO bucket, whatever we put CRISPR-Cas and gene editing in today, everything in the future will be in that bucket. And what does that do? It allows us to put it into corn, beans, and cotton. Everything else in the, everything else in the developing world, everything else in produce and flowers and cover crops, you name it, won't use it because it will be considered transgenic. And so that's where we get concerned. We're extremely excited about the pace of discovery. We've got to figure out how do we talk to the consumer and have a license to operate. There.
So I started with one very specific question, but do you have other thoughts about Dr. Zeigler's presentation? Andy, we'll start with you to follow up on that.
You know, I made a few comments, bullets to comment or make sure the points that I make. He made them all for me. I really believe that we're at a point where the science community has, and I'm talking science community writ large, has the challenge but also the opportunity to talk about what's happening, the discovery, why we're able to do this. When I was with the citrus industry, we were dealing with citrus canker. It was going to be $120 million to map the citrus genome. Couldn't do it. We didn't have the money in the industry. 10 years later, I think they did it for less than $100,000. Those discoveries are what are enabling plant physiologists, plant geneticists, plant nutritionists to deal with more efficient uptake of nitrogen, disease resistance. The worst thing that's going on today, nobody knows about it, is downy mildew in spinach. 50% of our baby leaf spinach is organic. We end up tilling up a significant amount of it because there are no alternatives to deal with that. We are on race 17 of downy mildew resistance in spinach, but it adapts about every 18 months. Can we have a more sustainable resistance to downy mildew? We think we can with gene editing, much more precise. The opportunities are there, but we have to be able to tell the message. And we have to step out of our realm in the public side of it, but I believe we have to do it in conjunction with the private, the private side has to step out with the public side and say, this is good for all crops. Animals as well, but we're only dealing with plants. The animal side of this, as you all know, is phenomenal as well. And how do we make sure that we're able to deal with the diseases that are now impacting the animal community and potentially down the road?
Ann, I'm going to pick on you next. Dr. Zeigler actually started with an alphabet soup of different organizations that have got some role to play in the science policy of agriculture and essentially the synthesis of the science that then informs policy. He mentioned Food and Agriculture Organization, certainly WHO from a food safety policy perspective is involved. The CG centers themselves are an extremely important part of that. We've got GFAR, the Global Forum on Agricultural Research. We've got the meeting of the agricultural chief scientists under the auspices of the G20. The IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, has increasingly also been focusing on agriculture. So with all of these players, how do we get some kind of more rational focus on the food security issues and the underlying science that's important to them?
Just a small thing, Kathy. Thank you very much. Now, I've actually thought a lot about this just because we do have so many organizations that are at work, and it partly depends, I think, on what are we addressing. If we're talking about policy, and if we're talking about global policy, and you want to have a commonality of policies that then push down, I've got to say the G20 and the meeting of the Ag Chief Scientists was one of the big breakthroughs, and I'm not buttering up, because I thought it was a great idea at the time, but it has, I think it has a lot of the components of what allows for change to happen. It's somewhat sub-ministerial, so that you can get down to slightly apolitical conversations, but you also are having the people who can then set policy in science, pushing it down in a common framework consistently. And I think that is a really important notion about how we can move some of the whole area of food and ag policy globally into a next step. And then where can we have that kind of commonality around science and knowledge? And certainly the CG centers and many of the international organizations that have been established help us do that. And your map, which shows all of them, was great because it's an example of here's the community that can come together with a sustained effort with the philanthropic community to help serve as, I think, a financial engine. And this is, we have got to lean on philanthropy. It's not just a little extra thing. They are very significant in how we can move things forward. And then you have, how do you share the data to make it happen? And organizations like FAO can really help us do that. But where I see is still the missing piece is then how do you translate all of that stuff into the user community that actually has to make the difference and pushing it down. I think we've been very fortunate in the United States and as well as some other countries to have the cooperative extension system. But I think the cooperative extension system is starting to show it's long in the tooth. It needs to be thinking a little bit more creatively about how you use new technologies and new tools to push that knowledge out to the user. There certainly is a good connection around certain types of users, but the breadth of it, and then how do you move it into other countries that may not have that extension system? So I guess the short answer is the way you work with those organizations is what level of the policy, science, extension, education community that you're trying to work with. And then I'm going to then finish my answer with responding to something building upon what Bob was saying, and that's social license. all of the stuff, what you talked about, the opportunities to stay on farm, the opportunities to stay land managers, to have adequate food distribution systems, is really about social license to operate. And that means that people who are making policy at the grassroots level, i.e. the general public, need to better understand what these systems are and need to be part of the solution. And I think this is where the extension model or education is one part of it, but really engaging with people where they are and having them be part of this process, I think, is absolutely critical. It's amazed me how difficult it is sometimes. Well, parenthetically, the fact that there are states that have had to pass laws for social license to farm or social license right to harvest trees is because that was the only mechanism to be able to keep certain productive systems going. So I think embracing that has got to be also part of our system. I'm actually I accepted the role of being on a standing committee for the academies on science communication. It's not about us doing better publishing, and it's not about us talking to our peers better. It's really how do we take these complex issues like GMO and not have CRISPR go the route of GMO, or what's the next thing, and how do you actually bring science and communications together? I just think that we're going to continue to have these burps and these bumps in our process until we can really do that in a different way.
Thanks, Ann. Dr. Glauber.
What about this question of the public investment in science and the dilemma that Dr. Zeigler raised about the privatizing of the benefits?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you go back over the broad span that Dr. Zeigler was looking at, and looking at just the enormous gains in productivity that we've seen over the last 75 years, and the outcomes. We've seen low, very low prices. I mean, this whole Malthusian dilemma that I read a lot of those books as well in the 70s, and yes, we saw price spikes in the 70s. We saw price spikes only 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and people were saying at the time, is this the new normal, that we're going to start seeing prices start to increase, after adjusting for inflation? And in fact, they didn't. They've come back down. I think you can look at a lot of the events 5 years ago, 6 years ago as more unique events and more of a confluence of events that caused what they did. But the bigger issue is, over the long run, do we continue on that path? And I think climate change really is an issue of if we're looking at that sort of impact on yields and productivity, what is the response? And most models that are out there that IPCC looks at and others are suggesting that real prices will start to rise. Now, some of the models show very small rises, others show larger rises. The question is how to address that. And I think unfortunately, what you see is that the good news is private R&D is going up. And that is, I think, very, very important. The problem, and it's not a problem for those crops that are being, where the research is going, the ones that can be, profits can be made, but the problem is there are a lot of crops around the world, particularly in poor developing countries, tropical products and other things that just aren't seeing that. And some of it is a regulatory challenge, as you mentioned, Ann. I think that some of the technologies that could readily help those crops, for whatever reasons, are not being, we're not seeing that sort of research. So how to marry those, I think, at a time when public resources are declining, unfortunately. And that's the thing that I think is the real tragedy. I mean, luckily we see Brazil and China and others step up their public research, but here in the US it's been flat or declining in real terms, certainly. And I think that there is some that particularly given the levels of funding that we're actually talking about. I mean, these are, overnight the administration was able to come up with $28 billion for farmers because of this trade war. You know, that would be how many years? 5 years or so of funding under research and development. I mean, I get questions all the time about cheap food policies, you know, and they're what people talk about. Normally what they mean is, oh, all these price supports and other things cause all these distortions, keep prices rolled down. And believe me, I'm the first to call those programs wasteful and everything else. But I don't think that they necessarily really depress prices of food. I tell you what's an effective cheap food policy is R&D. And for a pittance of the, compared to what we pay on these other things. But again, the marriage of that with how to encourage joint efforts there, I think is the real challenge. And Andy mentioned some, but I think that you know, I guess my point here is I think there's always going to be a role for public research because there is this public good aspect of it that, you know, for poor people in certain areas, they need that they need R&D to help them for the crops that they're going to grow.
Bob, any thoughts on those responses? And then I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions.
Well, I think you probably heard more than enough from me, but no, I think it's encouraging to hear at least that the panel is broadly on board with some of the main theses. To me, it really strikes home the value of the public investment in the public sector, and I think it's a real pity that we've seen for many years now, last few decades it seems, that the appreciation of the public investment and the public sector has really declined. And it seems in some ways it's almost an intentional assault on public investment. And I'm doing some work on sustainable rice platform globally. That can we develop sort of a fair trade instrument for rice to say that rice has been sustainably produced using best practices, et cetera. And it started in Asia, where most of the rice is grown, but we're translating it, working with USDA and others to translate that into an instrument that U.S. rice farmers can use. And one of the things that struck me was that there's like 41 questions that a farmer has to address over pesticide use, fertilizer use, best practices, what have you, you name it, varieties, and water management and greenhouse gas emissions. And there are 41 questions to answer. 27 of those questions a U.S. rice farmer can answer automatically because it is required by law for these practices. And that is a result of decades of work of the public sector to create the knowledge base and the framework so that a regulatory structure can be put in place so that farmers are growing rice safely and healthy for consumers, healthy for the environment, safe and healthy for the farmer. And that was all a public sector investment. And I think that if we forget that and we denigrate the public sector, we're just creating first of all, it's a great injustice, and two, we're cutting off, I think, the ability to continue to improve our overall agricultural environment. And that's just something that I'm somewhat, more than somewhat concerned about the direction things have been taking or placing.
Good. So anyone with a question, I'd like to ask you to go. There's a microphone on either side. So if you'll go up to the microphone.
Kathy, if I could just, while they're
sure.
going up to the microphone.
Assembling, you want to respond?
Agree completely with Dr. Zeigler. I mean, the public sector research and the public sector education is absolutely vital. Not only for the research that is done and it continues to do, they train our future scientists, they train our future food producers and others and farmers. So that system has to continue. But I can't help but highlight some of the bright spots that are happening out there on our campuses today. You talk to a lot of there's a lot of innovation centers that are going in, public-private sectors. Ag school is reaching across campus to the business school and to the engineering school and to the aeronautics school to deal with drones and to deal with computers. And we didn't used to do that. ag stayed in ag, and computers stayed in computers, and human health stayed in human health. And now you see these alliances on campuses that probably because out of necessity, but they've sort of opened their own silos that have been, I think we're seeing very beneficial. It is not consistent across the US though, and across our institutions. But you are seeing those bright spots where there's some relationships today that are really, really refreshing, and I think will be examples for the future.
Great, so it looks like all the questions are leading to the south side of the building. Dr. Bush.
Yeah, just I think all of these technological, marrying different technologies and disciplines together is a great move forward for agriculture and many of those disciplines as well. The thing I fear is basically what's happened in Europe and is happening with us, and that's the fear of technology. I've done several open forums, TED Talk type things on genetically modified organisms, and the fear of this technology and the impact on human beings is really constraining our advances. And I think I really think I can't see it changing. Getting the public to move forward and understand the fundamental concepts behind it is quite a challenge. Getting the public to recognize that it's really essential for us to move forward in overall productivity and nutritional quality of the crops that we grow. My great fear is that we're going to need a disaster. The only thing that's going to change this is a disaster of where there's really a massive impact on mankind, and that will be the place where the people will say, okay, let's solve these problems. But that educational aspect, I don't know how to get past it. It's, you know, I'm at a university. I taught intro bio to non-majors, and one of the things I talked about was DNA and how it works, and how for us, we're going to be modified in our lifetimes to increase resistance to disease or to fix disease problems, and trying to get kids that are English majors to get some fundamental understanding so they're not just fearful of it because of ignorance. It was a real challenge, and you know, doing that for all of America, I think, is our big challenge.
I don't think that was a question. Observation.
I tried to do
that. Next question.
I'm Chuck Weiss. I was the scientific advisor to the World Bank for a long time. Dr. Zeigler mentioned the problem of vitamin and mineral deficiency, and Dr. Bartuska talked about problems with the Agricultural Extension Service. I wonder if anybody is trying to light a fire under the CG to get a serious program of fruit and vegetable research going. The International Center on Fruits and Vegetables is in Taiwan, so it's caught in the politics between China and Taiwan. The issue is sufficiently important that there ought to be a solution of some kind to that issue. The CG had a program to help ag extension all over the world. That was allowed to wither, but the ag extension people are critical interfaces between the international labs and the national labs that are supposed to put them into practice. And here we have two critical areas of nutrition that are basically not being addressed, I think, by the CG. And I wonder if there's any thought of lighting a fire under somebody so that could be fixed.
I would defer to my colleague who is currently in the CG, and then I can come and offer yet another historical perspective.
Yeah, no, I think particularly, I know less about the extension, but the Fruit and Vegetable Center, I think, yeah, woefully underfunded. I think that would be and given the variety, I mean, there's a great case where the money goes, you can probably count on one hand or two hands in terms of where the money goes for fruits and vegetables, and yet the great variety of fruits and vegetables in tropical countries and others that just are seeing no advance. And so, yeah, I agree. I think that a fire probably does need to be lit. I think some would say that fire probably should be under the whole CG system on a variety of things, but I'll defer to the more experienced hand at the CG.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, I was going to say, when you were talking about a whole fire being lit, the mythical creature, the phoenix, came to mind, and maybe that's what we need. But there is I agree, it is a very, very serious failing on the part of the CGIAR, particularly, the inability to evolve to the second order problems that are facing us in nutrition that I touched on, vitamins, minerals, and et cetera. And that is, and that I think is a reflection, and then the allowing of the support of extension to wither. Two very serious failings in the CGIAR, and that is as the CGIAR has become more of a political organization, more influenced by politics than it had in the past. Back in the day, there was something called the Technical Advisory Committee, I guess it was, TAC. Alex McCullough, some of you may know, old crotchety ag economist out of California now. Outstanding intellectual visionary. And they set the direction for the CGIAR based on a rigorous analysis of trends and needs, et cetera. And the donors contributed funds to support along the guidelines of that Technical Advisory Committee. And it was basically a science-based allocation of resources. That fell by the way as politicians became more sensitive to where their money was going, and the CGIAR then and now is more influenced by political decisions and shifting winds of political feelings in some key donor countries. So I think that what we've got to, in the CGIAR, and I think other large international organizations need to pull as much of the politics out of decision-making as possible and replace that, again, with science-based decision-making. So, I mean, it's an excellent point and rather depressing to be reminded of it. But
could I add one? Just from a domestic standpoint, a lot of this is how we talk about things, and I've thought about this quite a bit. You know, we talk about corn, wheat, rice, and soy, and then we talk about specialty crops. Well, what are these specialty crops? I mean, it's everything else. And because you lump everything together in all the policies and all the programs and the research, you actually then don't give the different aspects of nutrition the same time and effort and money as you would as if it was corn, wheat, rice, and soy. So I guess one of the things I could see us doing in the United States is if we could shift to recognizing that we are moving into a world of, it's not calories, it's nutrition, and nutrition includes a real recognition of all the fruits and vegetables and other things out there that we need to be eating for that perspective. So I'm all for going away from the specialty crop name as this umbrella conversation.
I think we have time for one more question, and you're waiting very patiently.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I may be the only English major in the room, but I do totally empathize with what Dr. Bush said about science education.
Yes,
So my name is Peg Willingham. I work at Harvest Plus, which is part of the CG system. We're housed at IFPRI, and Dr. Zeigler, of course, Erie, a huge partner, and thanks for highlighting this. So this is for Dr. Zeigler, but the others as well can comment. You said that the whole golden rice imbroglio is a great lesson. What would you say is that lesson for policymakers, for researchers, for advocates? What should we do differently? It's so hard, I think. There's so much, you talked about the EU policies and how it's pretty tough, but what should we try to do differently as new technologies are introduced? Thank you.
Well, there's this great book that's just coming out. It has a chapter on golden rice. I recommend you all read it. It's riveting, absolutely riveting. The lessons. To me, how many lessons did I learn? But I didn't know how much I didn't know when we started on taking golden rice from a prototype, a proof of concept, to a product that would work in farmers' fields. And I think, to me, the lesson is that, the biggest lesson is that I think for a publicly funded institution to go into something like that, it really has to know up front what the resources are that are required in terms of what it takes to actually take a product through the entire regulatory process. The costs involved, the risks involved, the public relations that are involved, and the hard lesson that I learned is that a public research organization is not set up to take a product like that to market. And that, to me, was the hardest lesson to learn, and I did my best not to learn the lesson for many years. Sad but true. So I think that you know, my Australian friends talk about horses for courses and that sort of thing. And so I think we need to look at where are the institutions that are best suited to take a product the final mile, and then make sure that they're properly funded to do that. And it's a real challenge for me. And this goes back to the vegetable and fruits and vegetable question, is, you know, where's the money? Where's the money? Who's going to make money off of it? And the fact is that people are very, very reluctant to spend a lot of money in investments if they're not going to get a return on that investment. And so we need to look at items that have a large social value that we, as societies, are willing to make those investments and consider the social return in terms of healthy populations and productive populations as a good return on that investment. And I think that's, to me, is getting our policymakers, our decision makers to understand where and how to make these investments. That, to me, that's the biggest challenge.
Good. Well, please join me in thanking the panel, and especially
and now join me in thanking Kathy and the rest of the panel, and particularly Dr. Zeigler for a wonderful lecture. Thank you so very much. 10th anniversary lecture.